Bill, you look stern. What's going on?
I always feel that way when I feel challenged by technology. Sorry, and by election vote, vote counting.
Yeah.
Kind of
Understand that.
too. Does anybody have an opinion on whether we're going to know who our president is before the end of the evening?
For the end of the evening or the end of this meeting?
Well, either one. Probably not by the end of the meeting, but
Yeah.
unless we start hearing loud noises outside. No, maybe by the end of tonight.
I've been chatting with a friend of mine who's a voting rights attorney, and the fact is that even if the media picks a winner tonight, the Secretary of State has till November 20th to formally certify the count. And also, if the count is within 0.5%, then the losing candidate, whoever that is, can automatically trigger a recount, which will take days and days and days. So we are looking at several days to this, even if the media counts it. And even if my daughter's first vote, which was an absentee ballot from college, gets counted, yay for her. But still, it's going to be a while.
So that it could trigger a national recount, not state by state.
No, state. So if in the state of Georgia, whatever the count is, if it's within 0.5%, then the losing candidate can and probably will ask for a recount.
Oh, yeah.
But then even in that case, the Secretary of State does not have to certify it until November 20th, but the Secretary of State can choose to certify it earlier.
Well, it's 2 weeks.
Yeah. It's going to be a mess.
Well, I'm glad I can make plans for, my anxiety levels to remain pretty much as they are then for the foreseeable future. Okay.
Okay, we're getting lots of folks joining, which is good. It's just still a couple minutes till, so we'll wait just a couple more minutes before we get started. But welcome everyone who's listening in.
It looks like we're still waiting on Tom to join. Do you know if he is having any trouble getting into the meeting?
He actually, I'm sorry, I forgot to update you. He won't be on the call today.
Okay,
So
perfect. And then this is everybody. We're good from our end. Thanks.
Andrea, I guess you'll let us know when you want to kick this thing off, right?
Yes, I literally was just pushing my button. Thank you.
Okay.
So I'd like to welcome everyone this evening. I'm glad that we've got so many people that could take time to learn more about this important subject, even though there's lots of distractions out there in other places. My only election day joke, so to speak, is to say that I can assure you we will be done with this meeting before they're done counting ballots. So, because we're not planning on going for hours and hours and hours. So I appreciate all of you checking in. I'm going to hand it over to the TSW team, and they're going to be leading us through a series of updates that they have made to the plans. We're also going to be talking a little bit about the financial feasibility of such plans. If you have questions, you can put them in the Q&A box there, and we will try to address those at the end of the meeting. And we'll be monitoring those as we go along. So with that, Bill, I believe you're going to be kicking this process off for us from the TSW team. Oh, and one more thing. I'm sorry, Bill, to interrupt you, but for any of the panelists, if you could please remember to keep yourselves muted when not speaking. Thank you.
Okay. Well, I'm reasonably sure that this evening should be at least as engaging as watching election returns. So yeah, thanks for joining us. Sarah, if you want to put the next slide up, please. I think that what we want to do is just remind you, as Andrea did, of what we're here for tonight. This is just kind of follow up to previous meetings that we've had. And so the folks you're going to be hearing from today primarily will be TSW and Bleakley Advisory, but Long Engineering has also helped us put these plans together and been a key member of our team, along with, of course, with the city and all the folks that have participated from that side. So our agenda is pretty straightforward. In a moment, Sarah is going to take us through the items you see on the left-hand side of the screen here, in terms of the process that we've been through and what we're going to share with you tonight. And then we will review the 4 sites one by one and show you the revisions that we've made to the initial plans that you, hopefully, most of you were with us the last time we reviewed the preliminary drawings. And since that time, we've added some 3D renderings that will maybe make it a little easier to visualize what some of these concepts might look like. And then we'll talk about next steps. Sarah?
All right, thanks, Bill. I'll start out with where we are in the process. We are almost done. This is our final open house, and then we will have our pop-up at the farmers market on Saturday, and I'll go over the details of that later. And then after that, we will create our final report, finish with that, and then give a final presentation to City Council in December, I believe on the 15th. For those of you who have been with us throughout this entire planning journey, you are very familiar with the 4 sites that we have. But if you have not, we have the North River Village Shopping Center up on the northern end of Roswell Road, River Springs Shopping Center, which used to be Lohman's, Northridge Shopping Center at Northridge Road and Roswell Road, and then finally North Springs, which used to be Big Lots. Just a reminder of what this plan is. It's essentially a conceptual exercise. We're just looking at what is feasible, what's not, how these sites and similar sites could potentially be redeveloped in the future. And then we also wanted to understand the community's preferences for future development and try to represent that in our finalized concepts. What it's not is a zoning exercise, as in we're not rewriting the code, but we are making recommendations to change the code in order to make design better and any kind of redevelopment work better. And this is not by any means a final design for all 4 of the sites. In fact, we even have 3 per site. So it's just kind of an ideas exercise. The goals of this have been to ensure a variety of housing options to accommodate all types of residents, to improve multimodal connectivity throughout the North End, starting with these 4 sites and Roswell Road. We've wanted to model how mixed-use environments can work in Sandy Springs, build upon the existing green spaces and parks to create a cohesive public space network, and attract and support local businesses within the North End. What we'll deliver is, again, 3 illustrative concepts for each of the 4 sites. One conforms to the current code requirements. The next one is a little bit more creative and requires minor adjustments. And the third one, we could just think completely outside the box and may not be bound by the code. And then with those, we will have rough cost estimates of each concept, some financial feasibility for each one, and then recommendations for funding and zoning amendments. I'll go through some of the analysis. We engaged in a lot of analysis for this, but I'll give you the highlights here. So first, with the market study, the main thing to take out of this is that there's a big demand for a lot of residential and not much demand for retail space or commercial space within the area. Most of the commercial development will be the result of reorganizing the space that's already there. In terms of some of the connectivity analysis, this area has a slightly better walk score, which is defined by a lot of different metrics than the majority of Sandy Springs. And the ways that we can make that better and make the area more walkable include making Roswell Road walkable and accommodate multiple forms of transportation, adding a mix of uses which can reduce the number of trips that have to be made by car, and then increase transit options in the area. So We wanted to give you just a quick overview of each site. This is North River Village looking south as it is today. This is River Springs Center, again, as it is today, looking north up Roswell Road. As you can see here, it's not directly fronting the street, so that kind of played into how we wanted to redesign the site. This is North Ridge looking northeast. And then finally, this is North Springs Center looking southwest. Some of our overall assumptions that we've used for all of these sites is that the main thing and key to success to changing anything in the north end is changing North Roswell Road. Again, there's not much demand for retail, and retail is now changing even faster due to the pandemic and increasing online sales and all of that. And then there's a high demand for a variety of housing types, so we wanted to try to show that in a lot of our concept plans. And then each of our sites is designed slightly differently based on what is around it. I'll go through some of the public engagement. We've had a pretty robust engagement process despite any challenges presented by the pandemic. We had our focus groups and stakeholder meetings throughout February and April. We had our kickoff meeting when we were still allowed to be in person with a lot of people, and had 200 participants there. And then we had a virtual pop-up in June for a couple of weeks where we got some initial feedback on typical uses, building heights, a lot of different design elements that we could use to go into our draft concept plans, which were then unveiled in virtual activities on a weekly basis for each site. And participation for those varied by each site, but on North Springs, we received the most amount of feedback with maybe, I believe, 190 people participating. So we've received some really good feedback from all of you. Some of the main themes we've heard from that is that we do need a mix of housing options that are attainable at many price points, including single family homes and different forms of multi-unit buildings. There's a big desire for parks, plazas, green spaces, and connected parks and trails. There's a desire for mixed use with residential and retail. New buildings should not be taller than 5 or 6 stories, but many did say that they could go taller in certain sites to support more housing options and attainable housing. And then finally, that there is a lot of support for public funding of infrastructure like streets and public spaces in order to accommodate higher quality development, attainable housing, and more green space. So based on a lot of that input, we made revisions to the plans that we presented in August and September. We've added more green space, in particular on North River Village and North Springs, where we've put much larger community spaces. We've reduced some of the building heights, particularly on North Springs and River Springs, based on some of the feedback. And then we've acknowledged the need for city investment in housing and public infrastructure in order to make some of the redevelopment work more financially and meet the values of the community. So we're gonna keep you engaged with some poll questions. In your browser, on your phone, or on your tablet, whatever you're using, if you would please go to menti.com and type in this code. It'll bring up a screen, and I'll give you about a minute to bring it on your phone, and then we'll do a test question to make sure it's working before we get to the real polls. But have no fear if it doesn't work for the real polls. All of the exact same questions are on our virtual activities that I'll go over at the end of the meeting. So you'll still have a chance to provide the feedback. And when you open your phone, there should be the question that pops up. I'll give everyone about a minute to vote, and ideally it'll show up on the screen.
Hey, Andrea, I realize I forgot to mention that at the beginning, so maybe if we could give folks an extra minute or so to pull out their phones.
Sure.
That was my bad on that part.
Mm-hmm.
And for anyone who is still trying to log on, at the top of this slide, you can see the code that you need to enter into Menti, and it'll stay the same code throughout this presentation.
Caroline. And it looks like people are joining, but there haven't been any votes yet. So hopefully the voting will work. And once you're in, go ahead and submit a vote on this question. Okay, now it was, I don't know what was going on there, but now it's showing. Looks like we're all getting excited for Thanksgiving coming up. And it looks like most people are getting it to work. Andrea, do you think it's safe to move on?
Yes, Sarah, I think it's safe to move on. And I will remind folks that even when we're using these, when we have something actually that we're voting on this evening, other than your favorite holiday, these same questions will be available online in the virtual input that's going to be open for the next 10 days. So don't feel like if you can't get something to go through here that your voice can't be heard in another forum. So,
yes, thank you. All right, I'm going to pass it to Jonathan with Bleakley to go over some of the financial feasibility assumptions.
Thank you very much, Sarah. So again, I'm Jonathan Gelber. Which camera am I looking at? Let me look at so many cameras. Okay, I'll look at this one. So I'm Jonathan Gelber with Bleakley Advisory Group, and our job on this process was to look at the financial feasibility of the various scenarios. Overall, we had 14 scenarios, which is 3 or 4 on each of the 4 sites. And as Sarah told you earlier, that the way we look at this is scenario 1 is what can we do with the existing zoning? Scenario 2, what could we do if we are a little bit flexible with the existing zoning? Number 3, what could we do if the sky is the limit or the pie in the sky is the limit? What could we put on the site? So we at Bleakley Advisory Group took all these scenarios and we made what we call a financial pro forma, which is a complicated set of spreadsheets which looks at these sites the same way that a property developer would look at them, to look at, is this property even feasible, what we're looking at right now in today's market? Would this work? If it were to work, would people be interested in investing or building in it? So again, we looked at this tool called a pro forma that makes very broad assumptions, because we had to look at 14 different scenarios on 14 different sites. So we made a useful tool, but it's not, because it applies to all 14 of these scenarios, it's not something that you would use for every single one of them. If you went into one, you'd probably adjust the timing or the numbers or the values to make it a little more accurate. But this is a good way to look at all 14 of these based on the same criteria and see if it's useful or not. We believe that once you move beyond this initial screening, that each one would need to be refined a little bit as development and pricing details evolve on that. So the way we looked at this is we imagined, what if a master developer were going to come by and do this deal? What if the developer was going to buy the site from the existing shopping center owner and then go through all the trouble of demolishing the existing buildings, designing and preparing the site for redevelopment, building all the roads and stormwater and curbs and gutters and landscaping, sewage, pipes, water, all of that. Also doing the rezoning and permitting and anything else needs to be done. And then based on the site plan, this master developer would take the individual building footprints, whether it's mixed use, whether it's retail, whether it's condominiums, whether it's single family, and they would sell those lots to a vertical developer who would then come in and pay for those and go ahead and build this out. So what we're looking at is a 24-month period of the master developer coming in to do all this and then sell the individual lots to the vertical developers. Let me go to the next one. So we looked at a land cost that was based on recent area comparable sales, and we adjusted that for inflation and speculation. We looked at actual real development values and site prep values from other real world projects that we've been working on and with other clients at our firm. And in this case, the master developer would cover the land cost, the site prep costs, and the financing. Then the vertical developer would cover the building costs, parking costs, and expected construction costs. What we came up with is 3 levels of feasibility. We did a traffic light kind of scenario to help just make it easy to understand. That if we give it a red light, that means not feasible, that you're spending more on this development cost than you would make in selling the lots. That's not a deal, you're losing money on the deal. Yellow light means that it's potentially feasible, maybe, that you're making money, you're not making enough money that you would be able to attract private sector investors in to say, hey, this is a good deal. I'm going to make enough money there to make up for the risk I'm taking. So in that case, it's potentially feasible if you did some sort of modifications, concessions, or a public-private partnership. That means if there was some sort of, if we increase the zoning a little, if we increase the price points a little, if we maybe got some sort of concessions or incentives from the city or someone else to do something, that might be a good deal. It's worth thinking about a little more. Finally, there's a green light, which means feasible. Let's go, do it, do it, do it. But of course, there's some caveats in each of those. One of the things about that is in some cases, you're putting in enough density that it is feasible, but because the way development works, once you start getting higher and higher buildings, because of elevators and building codes and construction costs, it costs more per unit to develop big and tall buildings. You got parking, you got elevators, you got fire suppression, you got a lot more structure involved. So generally, when you're looking for redevelopment that is attainable or affordable at different price points, you don't want to be going into these very, very tall buildings like you might see in Midtown Atlanta, even though you can put more density in there because your unit costs go on. So we need to be clear that some of these that pencil out as being feasible, when you actually get down to it, that might not be quite so feasible because this market might not be able to achieve those kind of rents, or because it would just be too expensive to build buildings that high in this market. So at this point, I'll bounce it back to Sarah.
And Bill, I'll give it to you now.
Okay, I have been bounced. Thank you. Thank you, Jonathan.
Thank you.
We're going to start with the northernmost of the 4 sites, North River Village. I think everybody knows where this one is by now. You know, the river is immediately north of this in this image. You may have noticed earlier there was a different acreage number. Since we started the study, some of you know, we have actually added acreage based on discussions with city and with the property owner. So the image here shows a square that is labeled existing bank that was initially excluded from the site. We've added that back in because that belongs to the same owner. And similarly, there's a triangle at the south end of the site that's partially covered up with the scale there. That's been added in as well. So we now have a 12.7 acre site. The existing zoning here is SX6, mixed use. It does have existing retail tenants, some of which are, I think, doing reasonably well even during the COVID era. Plenty of parking. This site is, as you may know, because Roswell Road is sloping down towards the river, there is grade change that's significant here. And at the south end of the site, Roswell Road is about 30 feet above the building pad where the existing buildings are. And the final comment, just for context, is that it is surrounded by multi-unit development immediately to the east, primarily. Okay, so since the last schemes that we've shown you, there was a good bit of interest and discussion around the idea of looking at additional green space on all the sites, but especially this one. And as Jonathan and Sarah have said, this whole study is about trade-offs. And so we're going to be talking about, how do we achieve that additional green space, because somebody has to pay for it fundamentally. And so options 1 and 3, which are the denser of the 3 schemes, we are looking at the addition of a 1-acre public park that was not part of the schemes previously. We've also excluded from the analysis some of the infill development that we had shown as a possibility to the east of the North River site. So that is no longer part of the image that you'll see. And then finally, and we'll talk about this when we get there, but in the third, the most dense scheme, we have looked at even taller buildings than what were considered previously, just to see, how that might change the financial picture for the options. Okay, next slide. Existing conditions, as I mentioned, well, one of the triangle to the south, now south is to the left on your screen. So that triangle that is under this block that's labeled assumptions, but you can see the additions of those 2 parcels. This also shows in white the infill area that I mentioned at the bottom of the screen that was previously shown as a potential part of this redevelopment. And it's now just labeled as a possible opportunity in the future, as well as the site that's immediately to the north of the North River Plaza, which is the North River Tavern site that fronts on North River Parkway there. Just acknowledging that, if this were to be developed, that might also be a very desirable additional redevelopment site. I'll point out one other thing about this, because it's important if you heard the last conversation about this. The existing center has a small courtyard in the middle, which you see on this drawing. And so I want you to focus on that when you see the next slide, because we've kept that courtyard. Sarah, next slide, please. Thank you. And so that courtyard in this scheme has survived as now as a 2-story courtyard space that would be a food hall and sort of the entertainment focus of this neighborhood, if you will, with some office perhaps on the upper floor. And then immediately in front of that, where there was an additional mixed-use block previously that had a parking garage, that has now been replaced by the park that I described, and a smaller block of townhomes. That's where the P2 indicator is there. And by the way, those represent the 2 perspective drawings you'll see, the 3D massing studies that you're going to see in a moment. So with the removal of that block, that reduced the density of this plan. So this option 1, which we call the vertical mixed use scheme, which is essentially achievable with minor changes to your existing code, would yield a total of 524 residential units. You see the summary down there in the lower right. And a substantial amount, 130-some thousand square feet of commercial. So that residential density is about 41 units per acre. And if we go to the next slide, this is what, and remember, this is not intended to represent the architecture per se. This is just basic massing. So what does that density look like on this site? And so you're looking in the first of those two 3D drawings, you're looking, you see Roswell Road going to the north in the lower left-hand corner. And so you can just barely see the 1 acre park on the left-hand side of the screen, but this gives you an idea of the massing that that scheme might represent. And you see that there are some parking structures that would be partially above grade, visible from Roswell Road along the frontage there and deeper into the site as well. Those can be concealed with landscaping, but they're there. This is a view looking into that 1 acre park, just to give you a sense of what the scale of that space might be, and again, the trade-off that would represent. This would clearly be a desirable thing to have, but because it, as I said, it has to be paid for somehow, then I think the next slide, Sarah, talks about some of those trade-offs. This, as you see, it shows a green light. As Jonathan described, we think this scheme can work financially, which means that it doesn't absolutely require incentives from the public side in order to make it work. But as Jonathan pointed out, in order to make it work and to provide affordable or attainable housing, you know, depending on how far you want to go in that direction, then you start getting into the questions of what incentives would be needed for that to happen. This is a bit of an issue with any one of the mixed use higher density schemes you're going to see, because they all require structured parking in order to provide enough parking spaces. And what I think we've concluded is that all of the 4 sites that we've looked at in this part of Sandy Springs, the rents that are achievable there would make it difficult to justify the expense of structured parking. You know, we're not quite there with the rents that market rate would achieve in those areas, but we think it's doable here. And probably this is the most likely of the 4 sites where that would be more attainable in terms of a rent structure, because of the proximity of the river and the fact that, you know, there is going to be the city's engaged in a river access study now that would provide access fairly near this site. So, as I mentioned, it works to code, but maybe with some minor questions about the townhouses as they are described in the code today. Going to the second option, which is a lower density scheme. In this case, we've dropped, you know, the number of 6-story buildings in favor of more townhomes. So the overall density here is more like 35 units to the acre. And as you see in this scheme, there is no 1 acre park. And otherwise, I think this scheme is basically similar to what I've just described. So we can flip to the next slide just to get a sense of what that looks like. And as you can see, the frontage along Roswell Road would not necessarily be that different, but the overall feel, once you get into the site, would be a slightly lower density, lower profile. And so that's the different sort of character that this might have. And then again, the same view looking from Roswell Road, or similar view rather. This gives you a sense of what the multi-use trail might feel like as you pass along the frontage, with a combination of 5-6-story buildings and some lower garage structures. This garage structure that you see here, it may in fact be that only 1 floor of that garage would be exposed to view, depending on how the grading is done. So next, we'll talk about feasibility of this scheme. This one also works. It's a green light. And the reason it works at a lower density is that we're not trying to pay for that 1 acre park. So again, trade-off. Otherwise, I think this outlines some of the things that we would suggest might be done in terms of adjustments to the code to make this kind of a plan work, some of which apply to the previous scheme as well. But they have a lot to do with just the way the standards by which townhouses are supposed to be built. We would want to permit smaller lots and maybe narrower streets. And then, some of the structural requirements that are currently in place for taller buildings, if possible, we would want to see those adjusted. All right, and then we have one more scheme on North River, which is, as I mentioned, looking at what would happen if we went to taller buildings. And this scheme looks essentially identical to scheme 1, option 1, except that we get substantially more density. Instead of 524 units, this one would yield 892. So that goes up to 70 units per acre. With that kind of density, the idea represented here is you could pay for a park. You could probably also start to provide a substantially larger number of affordable units, keeping in mind what Jonathan said, that taller buildings, it's more expensive to build those, but still that added density does give you more latitude to provide that broader mix of price points. So I think those are the options there. One more page that looks at views from the ground level. We had 6-story buildings. Now we have 10 shown in these views in some of these locations. Certainly that's a different impact, but from the ground, it probably doesn't feel all that much different, honestly. Again, green light, same concerns or issues regarding how we might need to change the code. So that's sort of the story on the North River site. And I'll hand that back to Sarah so that we can just do a quick poll on what do you think about those adjusted plans.
Sarah, this is Andrea. We're getting a couple questions that I think might be relevant to answer now versus to wait to the end because they're specifically about this particular site. Should we take this opportunity here or after you ask the?
Yeah, sure. We can answer some now.
And some of them I think are best answered by your team. And I want to kind of answer some of these live for the benefit of everybody there. So does multi-unit mean apartments for rent? And I think the answer to that question is multi-unit could be apartments. They could be of ownership or rent. We haven't necessarily defined those here in the concept plans.
Correct. Yeah.
We had a specific question about square footages and number of bedrooms on the townhomes. Again, because these are conceptual plans, not a zoning plan, those haven't necessarily been taken into account here. So again, these are very high level. Did you want to comment on that, Bill?
Well, I'll just say that because I didn't speak to this, we've used what is kind of a pretty typical townhouse footprint, which is, about 21 feet wide, which can be a 2-bedroom, it could be a 3-bedroom, it could be a 4-bedroom townhouse, depending on how you outfit it. Okay.
Thank you for that clarification. Someone else had a question about live-work options. Someone from the TSW team might want to explain what is meant by that.
Yeah, and I should have spoken to that. I apologize. In the plans, I think we spoke about this a little bit last time. Some of the sites that we identified as suitable for townhomes had more of a street presence, as you drive through that site. And I think that you'll find that that's the case in some of the other schemes as well. Whereas other townhomes are a little bit more secluded and less exposed to passing traffic. Those sites we think are suitable and actually appropriate for what essentially would probably look like a townhouse, but it could be used for a live-work purpose. and given the changes that we expect to see in the workplace from COVID, we believe that live work is going to be a very sought after thing, to have an actual storefront location where you conduct your business essentially downstairs from where you live. So that was the intention regarding live work. If there's a more specific question about that, happy to answer it.
Okay, thank you. And then I think we have a couple of, I'm not going to answer comments because again, we'll capture those as part of the public input process, but I think there are a couple of questions about traffic impacts. And I'm going to take a stab at answering that question. I mean, the reality is, anytime there's additional uses on a site, there is the potential for additional traffic on a roadway if you have more people coming in and out. But I would also say that, it really needs to wait to the point at which you're really looking at a specific zoning plan, because in some cases, commercial properties like shopping centers, if they're actually operating at where they should be, can sometimes generate more traffic than the actual new housing. So again, generally speaking, we acknowledge that there could be additional traffic, but until you look at a specific site plan, it's a little bit difficult to tell, and all of that would be looked at the point at which a permit came in. I would also comment, there was one question about what if all four of these transition at the same time, and I think, Jonathan, you can give some more insight on that, but it is not our belief that all four of these shopping centers would redevelop at the same time. That's that's too much new stuff on the market, and lenders are not likely to loan money for construction loans on all four of these going on at the same time.
Yeah. Each one of those would be its own deal. It might conceivably, if the market suddenly said, hey, this area is booming, they might all go at the 4 times. But we've seen now, I think, 30 or 40 years without any real significant building or development in the north end of Sandy Springs. So I don't see any reason that suddenly that'll turn on a dime and go crazy. What we're trying to do is figure out how can we make some of these deals start to happen now, get some more activity going on in the north end.
And Andrea, if I can chime in too, and again, we talked about this a little more in previous conversation, but especially North River, it has existing leases in place that will make it very unlikely that that property would get redeveloped in the near term anyway. The other sites, have some of those kind of current obligations, but I think in some of these instances, one of the things that we have not been able to model, given the number of moving parts that we have, is the fact that some of this redevelopment could happen in a more incremental fashion. And so, it will occur over a period of years.
Okay, good point, Bill. Okay, I just thought that was important. I think some of those questions were coming up over and over again, and so I wanted to address those up front because they relate to all of the plans that you're going to be showing moving forward. So back to you, Sarah.
All right, thanks, Andrea. Looks like most people prefer the one that actually meets the code. So thank you for that input. And now we'll move on to the River Springs Center. This one is the former Lohman's. It's a little under 10 acres set back from Roswell Road and slightly higher than the street. This one has an SX3 shopfront mixed use, meaning that mixed use development needs to be on basically any ground floor, and the building height maximum is 3 stories. As of April 2020, when we were working on our analysis, there were 24 existing retail tenants, significant amount of parking spaces. We also felt that the out parcels in front present an opportunity for redevelopment and site acquisition that could all kind of work together as one site, but we didn't model that out. And then this is also adjacent to a single family residential neighborhood, which is a protected neighborhood district within the code. Again, this is the existing conditions. North is to the right. Our assumptions on this site is that it is better suited for residential because it's separated from Roswell Road, so commercial development wouldn't be as visible, and it would serve as a transition into the existing neighborhood to the west and to the north. And then we're trying to keep the amount of commercial space on any of these sites relatively low, just because of the demand. And then again, these parcels outlined in red are opportunities to connect into the site. And then we used all 3 of the access drives as our new street locations. And then as Bill mentioned, some of this may need to happen in phases. So we looked at where we could kind of divide the site into feasible blocks for phasing and of the redevelopment. So this is the first option, which meets the current code. All of the buildings are 3 stories tall. Any building that faces a street must have commercial on that street. So most of these are mixed use buildings. We have the street coming in from Hightower Trail over to the one that leads into the parking deck for the mixed use building, the larger mixed use building. And then we have a smaller green space between the smaller buildings over here that could be activated by the commercial on the floor there with some multi-units on the top. And then another thing that we found as a great opportunity is the, which we didn't fully design out, but we did create a concept for it on later versions, is this green space over here currently owned by the Hunt Cliff HOA, but there's a lot of stormwater detention there. Maybe there's an opportunity to create a usable green space out of that. This is showing the site looking north, showing how just massing these buildings in here and how they relate to the proposed buildings. The green space here, which will be the eye level view right here from the street looking into that little plaza and green space with restaurants or any kind of commercial and residential around it. This option works financially. However, again, as Bill mentioned and as Jonathan has mentioned, the structured parking does require higher rents, and it makes it a little harder to make it work for providing some of that attainable housing. And with these mixed use scenarios, you do need the structured parking just in terms of keeping it take up less land. And while this works financially with the code, it doesn't allow as much creative design. So if we wanted a larger green space, that would likely push it to the point that it might not work. So kind of some of that is the challenge of the current code. And along with that is some of that ground floor commercial, the requirement that it needs to be on all streets within the development may lead to too much commercial space. And then finally, some of the street width and design requirements in the current code limit the amount of developable land. So we would maybe need to squeeze those down a little bit to fit more green spaces or a little bit bigger buildings. This second one here focuses more on missing middle housing. There are no parking decks on this one, but a range of housing options with townhomes, small multifamily buildings with 6 units each, some live work, townhomes over flats that kind of function like a duplex, they're just vertical, and then some single family homes. And then smaller green spaces throughout that kind of serve whoever, well, they're public, but they also front onto whoever lives there. And this is a view again, looking north at this site, showing how the commercial development could relate to the townhomes across the street. And some of these smaller pocket spaces between the buildings that start to make it feel a little more like a neighborhood. And then this is kind of looking from the northern end of the site, looking west into the single family homes and some of the townhomes over the flats, that potential enhanced stormwater park. And then if this current site that's a 1-story commercial were to redevelop, how that could look. And then this is showing just an example of, you know, a stormwater park, making use of the pond that exists there now, and you know, how the buildings could front it and people could use the space. This one actually does not work financially. And it's mainly because the land acquisition and preparation costs exceed the potential for revenue from reselling the lots and building the different types of housing. A lot of this is probably because the density is relatively low. to make up that difference. So there are things we could do, maybe keeping some of that mix, but changing some of the design, and maybe that would help. But one way to make this work by the code is potentially rezoning it to a different zoning designation that already exists, or also reduce lot sizes for multi-unit townhomes and single-family detached units, and then again with the street width and design requirements. This next one kind of combines the thought processes of the last two with combining some of the missing middle housing with a larger multi-unit building, keeping some of that retail and office mix, but it's a much lower amount of commercial space here. We have some live work units here, some mixed use, a small mixed use building on the southern end, and then some townhomes, and then a larger mixed use building, or I'm sorry, multi-unit building that would be 5 stories stepping down to 3 stories in the back. And this is showing what that would look like. You can see the building step down. It's 5 up closer to Roswell, 4 towards the middle, and then 3 in the back. Some of the townhomes and live work units facing that new street, and then how those relate to the potential commercial redevelopment. And then this is looking into that same kind of green space park. This one does work financially, but the structured parking could kind of tip that depending on how many units end up there and how big the building is. In order to make this work by code, we would need to rezone either to RX5, which is a residential mixed use designation that allows taller buildings up to 5 stories, or SX6 with some minor modifications. We would need to allow standalone multi-unit buildings, potentially height bonuses for taller multi-unit buildings based off of incentives, and then removing the steel and concrete construction requirements above 3 stories. You can build a 5-story building using wood frame construction and make it more affordable. And finally, the next one is that one, but the corner to the north is more townhomes and single family homes, townhomes over flats. So again, this is more focused on missing middle housing. There's no structured parking here. So everything is a parking lot or on-street parking, or the townhomes with their parking underneath. And so this just has more of a focus on missing middle housing as well, with a little bit of retail and office on the southern end. And this is
Sarah, can I interrupt real quick because you just said the word missing middle again. We had a question. Can you define what missing middle means, please, for the group?
Yes. Generally speaking, we usually build the larger single family homes or the larger apartment buildings, and the missing middle housing is kind of those smaller buildings in between, like the townhomes, smaller apartment buildings that you would see in older neighborhoods, and things of that nature. If Bill wants to add some more details there, he's welcome to, but it's meeting that range of unit types that we don't typically see anymore.
Yeah, it's generally, I think, a strategy that other cities have tried to pursue. You know, it's the way we used to build towns. Atlanta used to have all kinds of these missing middle building types that you know, allowed for less expensive construction that still achieves greater density than a typical single family or townhome community might, and more diversity, and allows you to then deliver more affordable, you know, more or a mix of price points more affordably than going to the tall buildings that Jonathan was talking about. So I think it's one of the things that we have wanted to explore in these schemes, and certainly this site that Sarah's working on has looked at, you know, how do those options compare with those that where you're pumping the density up with an apartment block, or, you know, a multi-unit block with structured parking. And Sarah, I know you're going to get to this, but the bottom line, does this scheme work? It's similar to your first one, right?
This one does not work either.
Yeah, so I think what we're finding in these exercises, given the land value, and Jonathan, you may want to speak to this, that, you know, although this would be, I think everybody would agree, it would be great if we could make this kind of redevelopment work on these kinds of sites. It just is really hard to justify a developer coming, tearing down what's there and rebuilding it unless you can achieve more, you know, more density than this. I mean, that's the bottom line.
Yes, so as we can see here, it does not work. Again, it's that land acquisition and site prep costs that Bill just mentioned. We could make it work by code, but we may need to have some kind of combination of a higher density building and some of these missing middle housing types with the smaller buildings and fewer units. So here's the next poll question about River Springs. We'll give you
Sarah, while this question is being answered, I think, again, a good opportunity to answer some questions that we're getting from multiple people that relate to all of these. I'd like to ask Jonathan to talk a little bit about affordable housing. We're getting a lot of questions about affordable housing and do these include that? And so, Jonathan, if you wouldn't mind addressing whether or not those are included in any of these plans.
All right. Why do I always get the easy questions? So one thing that's important to look at here is if you look at this chart that's on here right now, option 1, option 2, option 3, option 4, and status quo, that what we have had for the last 40 years or so since many of these things were built is the status quo, that very, very little new product has been added of any type, apartments, housing, townhomes, office, retail, that the way the market is looking in this area right now, the way the zoning works, the way demand works, is not a lot of people, not a lot of developers, at least especially private market driven developers, are coming in to build something. Now, affordability is something that is important and something that there's been a clear indication both from the public side and the city side is one of the desirable outcomes on this. But the fact is, from a market perspective, very few people are lining up to do even market rate stuff. So if there's further restrictions on that or qualifications that if you build X, you have to put in Y affordable housing. Right now, we're not even doing it with 0 affordable housing. So unless something changes in those numbers, affordable housing cannot really be a part of this deal from a pure market perspective. Again, if you expect the private market to come in and solve the affordable housing crisis in Sandy Springs, the numbers don't really work that way. We did some analysis in that, and we found that even for a moderate level of affordable housing, and if you want to get in the numbers, we defined that as what if there was a requirement that 20% of units had to be made available at 80% of AMI, or average median income for the area. That translates to roughly an apartment of $1,400 or $1,500 for a housing unit of about $200,000. In order to do that, just to break even on the market economics, there would have to be an additional maybe $50,000 to $60,000 per unit somehow washing out of these numbers. Now, whether that could be made up in land cost, whether that could be made up public subsidy, whether it can be made up in federal subsidy, whether it can be made up in some sort of public-private participation or nonprofit participation, that remains to be seen. But I was asked to look at this from the market perspective. Can the market absorb demands for affordable housing requirements in this? So again, from a very, very blunt market perspective, the market is not even picking up market rate housing at this point. So to go beyond that for lower than market affordable or attainable housing, that is going to be a challenge unless that financial gap is made up somewhere else. Now, as we do this, the city is currently undergoing a housing needs and demand study, and out of that is going to come some policy recommendations as to tools the city might use to address some of this affordable housing shortfall. That's a right direction to be going in, and we hope that there are some solutions to that. But again, as we're asked here from a market exercise, it is very unlikely that a purely market solution will make affordable housing a possibility at these sites, when right now not even market rate housing is being built. So
Okay, thank
Tough
you.
answer.
Yeah, it is a tough answer, but we had multiple questions and I felt like it was a need to address that. One more question on River Springs, because it's River Springs related. We have a question about which one of these options actually has the most green space. Do you know, Sarah?
I would have to look at the numbers again. I believe between public and private green space, it might be option 1, but all of the other 3 also have, they're just smaller, but they're all pretty comparable.
Okay. All right, thank you. We'll have some additional questions answered throughout. Thank you.
All right, we will close the voting on this, but again, we'll have some online engagement where you can answer the questions there and go in the plans more detail. And now I will pass it to Ryan to talk about Northridge.
Thanks, Sarah. Go to the next slide. So the Northridge Center, located here, essentially at the intersection of Northridge Road and Roswell Road. Primary frontage is along Roswell Road here with a access off of Northridge. Same zoning as the last site we just looked at that Sarah reviewed, the SX3 shopfront mixed use. This center has 13 existing tenants. One that's currently in the old Kroger space, the large part of the structure there that's currently the Goodwill. And again, interesting topography on this site as we've seen in the previous 2 sites, with Northridge being the high point and it's starting to drop off. If we want to go to the next slide. So what have we changed since we last spoke? Originally, we showed an option that tried to keep the Goodwill. Ultimately, that was a really tough design to make work. So we're going to show a design today that all 3 options will assume that Goodwill structure can be removed. And then also adding the connections to the multi-use trail along from Northridge Road. Next slide. So some additional assumptions here. The site doesn't have great visibility because of the topography from Roswell Road and extremely limited visibility from Northridge, again, because of how the topography works in this site, as I'm sure many are familiar. The site does offer some great views, though, to the north. Essentially, all that wooded area behind the current shopping center, the topography drops off, and it looks, it's the wooded area that looks into a creek bed. Well, it's an active stream, actually. That's quite lovely. So we wanted to make use of that during our conceptual plans. We wanted to make sure we highlighted that as a feature. And again, because of the limited visibility, minimal commercial that we see that could be implemented here, and with a focus more on the residential aspect. Next slide. So now we have option 1. And so this is keeping with the existing zoning. As you can see, we have 2 different residential types here, giving us a total of 148 units on site. Now, we're limited to 3 stories maximum with the existing zoning. So we're based on that, we're limited on how much density we can put on the site. And there's not the buildable, I'll say the buildable area, buildable area for the site is relatively limited here because we do have a lot of topography that's constraining that. So with this site, we're offering some retail, pure retail buildings along Roswell Road as you enter into the site, then coming into the mixed use structures that will have that commercial storefront on the ground floor with residential above. We're also assuming that we can, with a conditional use permit, with the existing code, we can implement some townhouses as seen here. And then with a larger mixed-use building in the back, that would have a parking structure. Next slide, we should be able to see some views of how this might look. So this is looking northeast with North Ridge Road down there in your lower right-hand corner. You start to see how these structures might start to form this space. The larger mixed-use building, again, needing to make use of a parking structure because of the limited buildable area, with the remaining structures either self-parking like the townhouses are, or making use of surface lots. Next slide. This is an interior view of that site. Again, trying to create nice pedestrian areas here. You can see some of the buildings starting to set back to open up onto some hardscape plazas. Again, as we go through these sites, we're not able to have a large flat public area like some of the other locations are, but you'll see some small public spaces scattered throughout the design with the main intent of that trail connecting through the wooded areas to the north, as I pointed out earlier. So next slide. Unfortunately, this one is not financially feasible based on the grading criteria here. Essentially just from the land acquisition and the prep cost involved to implement something like this, we're just not getting enough density on site. Again, I said there's 148 units here, which puts it at 14 units an acre. Challenges with the code. Again, the ground floor commercial, we feel that's just putting too much commercial on this site. And then the existing street designs, again, just taking up a little too much room and then not being able to go vertical to make this work. Next slide. Option 2, we started to add a little more height to the buildings, which allowed us to implement a third residential type. So this site offers 298 dwellings. So we're getting about 28 units per acre on this site. Again, you can start to see we're trying to work with the building locations to open up as much plaza space as possible. As you can see next to that P2 arrow, you see it's pointing towards one of the plaza spaces, which we'll see in one of the renderings shortly, as well as opening up some amenity space for the multi-unit buildings on the east part of the site. As you can see, we have start to get some nice green space and pool space for those uses. Go to the next slide. So you start to see how the massing works here. And you'll especially see this in our third option, but the ability to go vertical actually fits in quite nicely at this site, being next to particularly the high-rise office building there to the east. I believe that's about a 12-story building. And there's also some complementary multifamily adjacent in the area as well. Next slide. This is one of the interior views here. And it's not the one that I thought was going to be here. So excuse me, we're not looking at that plaza space as I thought, but we're looking in the opposite direction. To the right, you see some of those retail liner buildings that are proposed along Roswell Road. And then our live work buildings here to the left of the image. And you start to see how the pedestrian realm can start to take shape with this design. Next slide. So again, unfortunately, this one is not working based on our current grading strategy. One of the things, well, actually, it's similar things to our first option, structured parking We're just not getting enough units, to really make that feasible. However, I'll take that back. It is feasible, but it would require the higher rents. It's not an ideal situation. Typically a developer would want to see in the range of 300 units before they start implementing or relying on a structured parking. But how to make this concept work by code? Again, allowing standalone multi-unit buildings, removing that requirement of ground floor commercial, increasing that building heights to increase being able to increase the density there. And again, the steel and concrete construction requirements does hinder some of the building types that were put on that site. And Sarah mentioned this earlier, and I'll just reiterate. You can get, up to a 5-story building with stick or wood construction if you have the concrete podium, can get you up to that height. So there are ways to do it, and it's something just to consider. So we'll go to the next slide. So this is option 3. Option 3 has a total of 720 units, and that's mixed within 2 different unit types here. And I'm separating the large multi-unit building that you see there that we have at 10 stories and 8 stories, and then the smaller multi-unit buildings that are kept at 3 stories there to the south. Those smaller multi-unit buildings are a nice flexible unit type that can also be considered a missing middle type, depending on how the unit types are arranged within. That's a nice flexible footprint that can account from anywhere between 6 2-bedroom units, that would be 2 per floor, or you can do 4 1-bedroom units on each level, and you can do a nice mix with that. But I'll back it up a little bit. So along Roswell Road, again, maintaining that retail frontage along Roswell Road. And then as you enter the site, coming into the development of the residential development. And one thing I neglected to mention in the previous 2 sites, but I'll point out on this one, each one for vehicular circulation, we do want to maintain a access for the community, such as you come in North Ridge Road, you'd be able to have an access drive into this site and then also exit out onto Roswell or vice versa. So maintaining those 2 connection points are definitely key to each of these designs in making sure there's a streamlined connection to each road there. Let's go ahead and go to some of the renderings to start to talk about the design a little more. Now this is, especially with the massing model being illustrating a bright white building here, might look a little shocking. But it's definitely something that could be considered, and it is something that actually helps with this site, with it being a limited developable area, is to intensify the density here. We're getting about 68 dwelling units per acre on this 10-acre site. I believe option 3 for the site that Bill presented first, I believe he was getting close to 12 or 70 units per acre on that one, and he had about 12 acres, I believe. But we start to see how this can take shape, again, complementary with the existing land uses, with the 12-story office building to the east, and surrounded by existing multifamily and office uses. So this one is not totally out of the question for that height. Go to the next view. So again, this is a very similar rendering to what we saw previously, because we are maintaining that retail frontage that you see on the right. That's retail frontage on Roswell Road, and then bringing that pedestrian activity to the interior through a mix of hardscape plazas and small pocket parks. Next slide. So we get to one that is feasible, and I assume there might be some questions about this, so Jonathan might chime in so he can correct me if I'm wrong, but I'm pretty sure it's just really based on density here, is getting those numbers up to make this feasible. And then let's see, and then how to make this work by code. Again, very similar to the last option that we reviewed, is being able to increase that building height, being able to work with the current regulations on street types and widths, possibly make some of them a little thinner than what's currently on code, to give more buildable space to the actual residential units, and then getting rid of the ground floor commercial requirement. Next slide. And so this is now where we're ready to vote. Sarah, I don't know if you're going to chime in, but same as the last two options we saw, vote on your preferred. Option 1, 2, 3 are maintain the site as it is. And again, if you join us late, the menti.com address website is at the top with the access code. There we go. It's great. Always love seeing these live results come in.
Andrea, were there any questions we should answer right now?
I think so. I think most of them are fairly general to the project overall, so we can address those at the end.
Okay, great. I'll give about 10 more seconds and then we'll move on to the fourth and final site. All right. Now we're moving on to North Springs, Big Lots, former Big Lots. Go through those concepts and then next steps, and we'll be ready for Q&A. So this site is the smallest of the four with just under 9 acres. However, we are considering the emissions testing and U-Haul area and the current gas station within our concept plans, just because of it makes sense to keep those all together for development purposes. There's currently one existing retail tenant. The zoning on this site is slightly different than the others. It's a CX3, which is a commercial mixed use district. And the difference here is that the ground floor commercial requirement is not within this district. And this one is again adjacent to a protected single family neighborhood district by code. The changes we've made based on the input for this site, we've added a pretty significant large green space on the northern end of the site for all three of the options. We had some concepts in the last iteration that had much higher buildings. We received a lot of feedback that that was too much, so we reduced the building heights on all three down to 3 stories maximum. And then because of these design changes, we had to redesign some of the mixed use and multi-unit buildings to accommodate the green space. So this is the existing conditions. North is to the bottom right. Our assumptions for this site are that no phasing was needed because the site is almost completely vacant. It's better suited for residential because of the proximity to the single family residential around it. We again, we're trying to recommend minimal new commercial space, and all the concepts and those 2 properties on the northern end by Dalrymple are included in the site plans. So this is the first option here. We have the new green space down, which is on the north side of the site, but it's at the bottom of the screen. We have a larger multi-unit building on the southern end of the site, which is on the top of the screen, and then some mixed-use buildings here in the center, and then townhomes in the back that would transition into the neighborhood. But this green space is much more than an acre, and it can provide a significant amount of open space for anyone in the area, and we envision it as more of a public park. And as you can see with the mixed-use building just on the other side of the street, that plaza space starts to relate well with the street and the park, kind of creating all one big unified space. So this is a view looking into that with looking to the southwest with that mixed-use building in the background, and just showing the scale of the park compared to the buildings next to it. And then this is an interior view of the park, just showing the relationship of the park to the buildings. So this one does not work financially, mainly because of the, as on all of the concepts, the density is too low. And then also building that green space does cost money. So it's a matter of where that money is coming from. And then again, the structured parking requires higher rents than what the market supports. The challenges of the current code, 3-story buildings make it difficult to support the parking decks. And then if we have the lot coverage requirement here, we've exceeded it, but in some of our earlier concepts, hitting that 85% lot coverage requirement, which is buildings only taking up 85% of the land, it was a little bit difficult to meet and make it work. And as you can see, once we exceed it, it starts to not work financially. The second one here, we've reduced the green space slightly, put some larger buildings around it to kind of activate the space more, give people more of a reason to be there. So we have a few mixed use buildings, which would have retail or office, some form of commercial on the ground floor, and then 2 floors of residential above. And then this has much more of a mix of housing options, again, hitting that missing middle range with some smaller walk-up apartment buildings, some multi-unit buildings on the southern end here, some small single-family homes next to some townhomes, and then townhomes over retail, kind of similar if you've seen a building on the Beltline by Studioplex, there's some townhomes over some retail there that front the Beltline, and then some mixed-use buildings over on the northern end. Again, this view is showing from, looking into the park and how the massing works with all the different unit types and how the park works with the rest of the site. This mixed-use plaza, or this plaza here between those buildings, really starts to activate some of that space and flows out into the park quite nicely. And then we can see that the building size really kind of becomes a lot more granular with these smaller townhomes and multi-unit buildings on the southern end. Again, an interior shot of the green space, just showing how that could look and work. This one could be feasible with some design modifications, maybe increasing, making some of the mixed-use buildings slightly taller, adding more density, with some public-private partnerships, having the city kind of help with either housing or the green space or some of the public infrastructure. But it all really kind of comes down to the density and how much parking costs. So to make this work by code, we would potentially rezone to an RX3, which allows more of a mix of housing options than the CX3 commercial does. We would need to reduce the lot sizes that are required currently in the code for some of these units, and then reduce the street width and design requirements, which is across the board on all of the sites. And then finally, this one further reduces that public park, but we do have another public plaza just on the other side between some retail buildings. So the space is pretty comparable, it's just divided a little bit differently. But you still get a pretty sizable park. I'd say that's a little over an acre with a couple plazas that lead to the street. and some mixed-use buildings around it. And then we have the mixed-use building served by a parking deck and maybe some office towards the back. And then on the southern end, again, a mix of housing with townhomes over flats, which are, again, are kind of treated like a duplex, but vertically. And then some smaller multi-unit buildings on the very southern end next to the car dealership. So this view doesn't show as much of the park, but just starts to get at the massing of the buildings that we're proposing, but you can still see how the park relates to those mixed-use buildings around it. And then the small public plaza over here between these one-story retail buildings and how that can be activated. And again, another view of the interior of the park, showing the relationship between the buildings and the public space. So this one, very similar to the last one, could work financially if there are some modifications or a public-private partnership, or a developer decides to take lower returns. And this one could also, it has the same things as the last for what would need to change in the code, potentially rezoning, reducing the lot sizes and allowing different types of housing units, and then the street width and maybe the lot coverage requirements. So we'll vote on this one. Again, the 3 options, and then keeping it as it is today.
Okay, Sarah, we did have a specific question about this particular site, and why, the question was, why is there more green space on this site than perhaps some of the other plans? And my answer to that would be, that was based on input from the community. When we talked about each site, for community got to comment on each site, and in this particular case, there was a lot more comments about wanting additional green space at this particular site.
Yeah, it was that, and then also some of the potential environmental cleanup that would need to occur with the gas station and emissions, and then there was a former dry cleaner. So all of that was kind of on the northern end. So. Yes,
thank you. So, and that, I think that relates to a couple of questions here, about that issue. And again, we do know that there are some environmental issues on this site, but the way TSW has designed it, hopefully the uses that are on that northern end of the site would be less impacted by that.
I might need to refresh this to make it show up. There we go. All right, we can move on to the next steps, but it looks like the third option might be the winner for this vote. And again, the same question will be available online, and we'll tabulate all the responses from this and in the virtual activities later.
Sarah, before you jump into next steps, I think this is probably a good point for us to be able to answer some of the questions overall. So there's some similar questions out there. And so I guess there's a couple questions about why is there not a community center or parks, et cetera, in here. And the answer to that really is that we asked the TSW team to get us a baseline of what, what would it take to redevelop these things from a private market perspective? That does not mean that the city does not have a desire to have public spaces out here, but we need to have a baseline before we understand what types of things that the city might need to come up with public dollars. And specifically dealing with some of the parks and the community center questions, really the cities following our adopted Parks and Recreation Master Plan, which I think is our Recreation and Parks Master Plan, when we're looking at options throughout the city for adding additional parks and those types of uses. And so that's really being driven by that adopted plan. And again, there may be opportunities on these sites in the future, but at this point in time, there's been no specific sites identified and no specific funding to build those particular pieces. So I think that's one question. Jonathan, I think there are several questions in here that maybe you can best answer. There's a lot of questions. There's a couple questions about, is there really demand for this type of retail out there? Is there really demand for this type of housing? And perhaps even just to throw it all at you, what is the impact of COVID on different types of real estate demand out there? If you wouldn't mind taking that question for us.
Oh, I get all the fun questions. Okay, I'll start with COVID. What is the situation with COVID? Temporarily, COVID has had two major impacts. Number one, it has taken a big, huge hit on retail, entertainment, restaurants, and hospitality. All of those things, which even in many cases were already struggling a little bit, they are, for the short term, taking a huge hit. Similarly, housing is right now taking a huge hit, especially apartment housing, because most of what's been going on with COVID, most of the job losses happened in kind of the moderate to lower income ranges. It's your retail workers, it's your theme park workers, movie theater workers, restaurant workers, hotel workers. These are the workers who have been put out of work by COVID. And they generally tend to live in apartments, particularly apartments that are, what we call the Class B or Class C apartments, a lot of which we have in the North End. So right now, those people are having financial trouble. They're doubling up, they're tripling up, they're moving back in with their parents. We imagine and we hope that will moderate and fix itself in time, and that there will be not long-term effects of that COVID. We did all of our market analysis right at the beginning of COVID. So what we are looking at is when the market comes back and normalizes a little, we find essentially two things. Number one, there is huge demand for housing everywhere, not just in the North End, not just in Sandy Springs, but the entire region. There has been a general underbuilding of housing for 20, 30 years now. There is a lot of pent-up demand for housing. So I forget what the numbers were. We're looking at something like 300 to 500 units a year of demand in this market. We think that if the market can build it, if the market works out, we think that stuff will get snapped up quickly. Retail is a more interesting case here because while there are enough people here that should be supporting the retail you have right now, you can look at these 4 shopping centers and say that there is not really enough, in actuality, demand to support these retail centers. That's why they're all performing poorly with lower rents and higher vacancy rates. What we have found is that we think there would be demand for a smaller amount of better retail. We have all of the big aging shopping centers we can stomach here, but if there were more housing, more activity, more people in this area, we think that there would be demand to take roughly maybe 20% of the floor space of retail you have right now, retool that into slightly better or different stuff, and we could reactivate that retail. But one particular thing about this market is you've got 3 huge, enormous retail areas right at either side of this. If you go south, you get to the Hammond Road area, you got your Whole Foods and Kroger's and Marshalls and office supply stores and Lowe's. So you got all that stuff down there. If you go to the southeast, you've got the whole perimeter mall area, which has every big box store, every national brand restaurant in the world. If you go north to Roswell, you get, again, every big box store, every national brand in the world. So those 3 spots kind of suck all the retail energy out of this corridor. So we think when this corridor does work in retail, it's going to be retail that appeals to local households, not that is destination people coming in from elsewhere to shop in this area. Was there a third question there that I missed, Andrea?
Sorry, I'm having a hard time driving between the mute button and answering questions. No, I don't think so. I think in general terms, you were just talking about demand for retail, demand for housing, and you've addressed COVID.
All right.
So thank you. Let me peruse through a couple of other, some of these questions are going to be answered, I think, by the end here, but I'm just kind of cruising through to make sure. Again, we asked the consultants to look at this from a market-based perspective. So I think we addressed the affordable housing issue earlier. They are not included at this point in time in any of these scenarios. We need to understand which scenarios could actually be made, and so they are not addressed in these particular scenarios. I think we had a lot of questions about, I do want to address, we had why are we showing that some of these are not financially feasible? And I think the reason for that is, frankly, this is a conversation with the community about what the community wants to see. Are we willing to have additional density on sites if we want to see these things redeveloped? Perhaps we're not. So this is really an exercise that trades off hearing exactly what the community is comfortable seeing, but the community also has to have the information to understand that some of these in the lower density scenarios simply do not make financial sense. A private developer is not going to put their money at risk to do that. And so, we want to be able to show that that's the case. And again, these are very conceptual, and this is exactly what this process is about, is to hear from the community what they want to see. If the community desires additional units on these sites, then, that is something that we've tried to incorporate here in a couple of different scenarios. Again, remember, each site, these are all conceptual, and they're all, there are 3 different concepts for each site. So this is not going to be a scenario where we're going to be going to mayor and council and saying, we're going to pick one plan, and this is a plan that's going to get built. We're talking about being able to change public policy in terms of our development code and the things we would like the community want to see out there. And that's what this process is about. So I want to caution folks, again, when we talk about putting in particular turn lanes or what a parking deck looks like from the outside, that is simply an unknown at this point. We can't get that specific because the city does not own these sites. The city is working with the existing private owners of these properties to encourage them to look at different things. But frankly, the private owners of this property will be the ones getting to decide what they want to do with their property within the confines of our existing zoning code. So I hope that kind of answered a couple of different questions. And as I'm flipping back through some of these, I think there was also a question about steel and concrete requirements. All of these, and Jonathan, maybe we didn't make this clear at the beginning, but I believe all of these, anything over 3 stories, we are, as the staff team and the TSW team, do not believe that any of these are financially feasible with the steel and concrete construction requirement in place today. Is that correct?
Andrea, I can speak a little bit to that. This is Bill. Ryan and Sarah talked about the fact that you can build up to 5 stories in wood. And most of the buildings that you're seeing, that have been built in the last cycle that represent the majority of the apartments and the mixed-use buildings that we've seen built around the Atlanta region have been in that 5 to 6 story range. Once you get above that height, then you do have to go to steel and concrete to make those structures work. And developers expect to do that, when wood is no longer structurally feasible. But Sandy Springs codes currently require that you use steel or concrete for, I think, 3 stories or above 3 stories. And so that is very much a disincentive for those developers who are trying. This is more or less the process that any developer goes through. They look at a piece of land and they say, let's do some capacity studies here to see what the code will allow us to build. And then we'll do a thumbnail economic pro forma like Jonathan's done and say, can we make this work? And if the answer is no, no matter what we do, then we're going to walk away. And so I think, as he pointed out, very little construction has happened in these areas in Sandy Springs. And so I think you can point to those code restrictions as being one of the key reasons.
Do we have any other questions we should answer at this point?
I'm flipping through here, so let me see one. I think. I'm sorry. I'm going back to the very beginning of the meeting. There were a couple of questions about the focus group and outreach. We talked about the focus groups. I mean, first of all, there were there was an advisory committee that the mayor and council appointed, and they were asked to assist with outreach. And those folks are actually listed on our city website page if you would like to see the specific individuals. But they primarily represented our homeowners associations and our neighborhoods. And also in the beginning of this process, we wanted to make sure that we talked to our existing residents. And so we had some groups representing our existing renters and also our existing business owners here in Sandy Springs. So I think that answers the focus group question. Let's see, that answers 3 or 4 questions at the beginning. And I think, yeah, I mean, again, in general terms, there's a question here about what happens to a particular property or particular businesses. Again, the city does not own these properties, you know, so we'll work with the private property owners, but, you know, frankly, that's up to the private property owners and their tenants to decide, you know, if these are things that make financial sense for them. It may or may not. So that's something that's a private development question. The city is not involved in those conversations. So Sarah, I think with that, you can kind of wrap it up because several of these questions here, I think it relate to presentations and will this be available online, et cetera, after the fact. And I think those are the major questions remaining. Well, I'm sorry, there are 2 here at the end that I did miss. Let me address these. There's one about higher end townhomes or townhomes in general or pure single family housing communities considered for these sites. And I think the answer to that is no, for 2 reasons. Number one, the community told us in the beginning meetings that they wanted to see a diversity of housing types. So we tried to include as many different types of housing on each site. The other piece of that, as Jonathan has pointed out several times, it is just not financially feasible for a property here to be filled with purely single family homes. The properties are just too expensive. So I think that answers the major questions, and take it back, Sarah.
All right, I'll go through the next steps. The first thing will be social pinpoint. You may recognize this from participating a couple months ago with the first draft of the concepts, except this time all of the concept plans and all of the renderings are available for the next 11 days through the 16th. There are you can leave some final comments much the same way as before, and then there is a couple survey questions, and I'm going to attempt to explain some of the navigation here because this is a pretty full, there's a lot of information in here, so we tried to make it as easy as possible to navigate, but we understand that it could be a little bit tricky. So when you come into the site, you will arrive here with this larger scale map of the whole area, and it explains how to participate over here once it pops up, explaining how to navigate between the sites. So in general, the sidebar will zoom, we have it by option. So it'll be option 1, code compliant, option 2, few modifications, and then option 3, you know, out of the box. So first you would click which option you want to view. And then to navigate between the sites, you can either zoom in, which could take some time, or you can go down to this legend here at the bottom, and each site has a little link, and it's going a little slower because I'm also running Zoom and Mentimeter at the same time, but you can navigate exactly to the sites themselves over here in the legend. So key point here is navigate first on the left-hand side between the option you want to see, and then navigate second on the right-hand side to the site you want to go to. And then within each of these, we have the financial feasibility explanation and whether or not it works. And then, and that's with the dollar signs. And then with the camera buttons, we have the popped up with the images. And there's a note up here, but you can click on them to make them larger. And much the same way as before, if you want to leave a comment, drag up from the top onto the map. And then over here on the left-hand side, we have our survey questions. So we have first all of the options for each site, and then the question for each site, and then an opportunity for you to tell us why you chose that option or any other comments. And then if you keep scrolling, you'll see all of them here. And then finally, once comments start populating, there's a left-hand side here, and this will start a rolling list of all of the comments that have been received on the map. So I'm going to try to get back into the presentation mode. There we go. So the next thing, we will also be at the farmers market on Saturday morning at 9 a.m. We'll have screens up with all of these concepts where you can come talk to us. We'll help you navigate through the online site, and we're just there to answer any questions and hopefully reach more people. We were really hoping that by now we could be in a public meeting forum and have this meeting in person with everyone again, but we found that the virtual and the pop-up could kind of be a compromise for that. And then finally, we'll have our council presentation December 15th, and the final document will be done by the end of the year. So that is where we are. Andrea, do you have anything else you'd like to say?
I don't think so. This has been good engagement. The big thing is, reminder, all of this will be on the city's website. The survey is live right now. A video copy of this presentation will be live tomorrow. And also a copy of this PowerPoint presentation will be on the website. So for any of your friends and neighbors that might have missed the meeting and want to see it, I really do recommend that. I know it was long, and I appreciate you guys staying with us, but there's a lot of information here, as you can see. And so some folks really do better seeing things in a visual format. So I highly encourage you to encourage your neighbors to get out and, download the presentation, get on the Social Pinpoint site, and give us lots of input. We had really great participation in the last round, and I'd really like to see at least that level of participation moving forward. So I appreciate everyone being here this evening. Thank you very much for attending.
Thank you. Very much appreciate everyone's time. So.